Deep space is a silent, hungry dark. The salvage vessel Odyssey's call drifts through that void, its crew hunting for scrap among the bones of dead starships. Then a sound breaks the silence, a faint, looping distress signal, bleeding out from an uncharted void known only as the Seraphis Belt. Captain Eva Rostova's voice cuts through the bridge tension as she orders an immediate course change. "That is a graveyard out there," she says, her words tight with dread, "and someone is still alive in it." Her decision plunges the crew directly into a mystery they were never meant to solve. By the end of this story, you will understand the true cost of answering a call from the dark and the terrifying secret one crew discovered when they ventured into a space graveyard. What awaits them is more than a shipwreck. It is a predator that feasts on memory itself. What would you risk to save a voice crying out from the abyss? The Star Drive whine faded into an unnatural quiet. Ahead of the Odyssey's call, the Seraphis Belt unfurled like a tapestry of nightmares. It was not a simple debris field, but a sprawling, silent gallery of dead ships. Hulking freighters, their cargo bays gutted and open to the void, spun in a slow, chaotic dance with the skeletal remains of military corvettes. There were thousands of them, a cemetery built not from stone and soil, but from shattered metal and frozen dreams. On the bridge, the only sound was the frantic beeping of the long-range scanners. Science Officer Jax leaned over his console, his face bathed in the eerie green glow of the data stream. "Scanning reveals no life signs," he said, his voice tight with confusion. "But the energy readings are off the charts. It makes no sense. This place should be a cold tomb, yet it's humming with a power signature I have never seen before." Then something colossal drifted into view, eclipsing the distant stars. It was a vessel, but unlike any design in known space. Its hull was a dark, iridescent material that seemed to drink the light, and its shape was all wrong. A collection of asymmetrical spines and curves that hurt the eyes to follow. Scarred across its surface were markings, deep grooves carved into the metal that formed no language they could decipher. The patterns were chaotic, almost violent, and utterly, chillingly alien. This was not the source of the distress call. This was something else entirely, a predator sleeping in a field of its victims, and the Odyssey's call was sailing directly into its den. The airlock sighed open on a breath of stale, frigid air. "Atmosphere is breathable, but cold," Captain Eva noted, her voice a low murmur in the oppressive stillness. Her helmet lamp cut a narrow beam through the absolute dark, illuminating a corridor that curved away into deeper shadows. The metal underfoot was not smooth, but textured with a strange, fibrous corrosion. Then her light caught something on the wall and she froze. A crystalline growth, like a cluster of frozen sapphires, pulsed with a faint, internal light. It was beautiful and utterly alien, a piece of dormant biology integrated directly into the ship's structure. Jax moved up beside her, his scanner humming. "The readings are off the charts, Captain. This is not just a ship. It is an ecosystem." A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature traveled down Eva's spine. They were not walking through a derelict. They were walking through a living thing, and they had just stepped into its veins. What kind of intelligence builds its starship from crystal and flesh? The fibrous corrosion seemed to cling to their boots as they moved deeper into the vessel's heart. The corridor ended at a sealed portal, its surface etched with the same violent, unreadable script. Jax bypassed the mechanism with a low hum from his plasma cutter, and the door slid back with a groan of protest. Beyond lay the bridge. It was a cavern of shadows and silent consoles, all built from the same dark, light-drinking metal. In the center of the room, a single console glowed with a faint, persistent light, a lone heartbeat in a dead body. "This is it," Eva whispered, her breath fogging her helmet visor. The source of the signal. Jax plugged his datapad into the console, the ship's translation software struggling to parse the alien code. For a moment, there was only static, a hiss of empty space. Then a voice crackled through their helmet comms, a desperate, multi-tonal language filtered into words they could understand. The log entry was fractured, jumping between speakers and moments of panic. "We tried to seal the lower decks, but it learns, it adapts," a voice gasped. "It does not just take the body, it consumes the echo of who you were." The final words were a raw, terrified shriek that dissolved into sobs. "The Devourer, it consumes not just flesh, but memory, identity, it is here." The transmission cut out, leaving a silence more profound than any they had ever known. They had come to answer a cry for help, but the voice was not calling for rescue. It was a warning, screamed from the edge of an oblivion that erased souls. And the log's final, chilling present tense hung in the air between them. "It is here." The static hiss that followed the final log entry seemed to suck all the sound from the world. Captain Eva stood frozen, the alien console's cold light reflecting in her wide eyes. "It is here." The words were not a memory, they were a present danger. "Move," she barked into the comm, her voice cracking with a command she did not fully feel. "We are leaving. Now." They retreated in a tight formation, their bootsteps echoing too loudly in the fibrous corridors, their helmet lamps swinging wildly, creating dancing monsters from every shadow. Engineer Chen brought up the rear, his own breathing a harsh rhythm in their ears. "I have a bad reading on the structural integrity behind us," he reported, his voice strained. "The corridor does not look stable." He paused, his lamp beam fixed on a section of wall that seemed to ripple, the strange metal softening like wet clay. "Guys, the wall is moving." Before Eva could respond, the comm channel filled with a scream, a raw, sharp sound of pure terror that was severed in an instant. It was replaced by a burst of deafening static, and then a new sound layered over the white noise, a wet, organic tearing like fabric being ripped apart, slow and deliberate. Then silence, absolute and suffocating. Chen was gone. His biosignature had vanished from their scanners as if he had never existed. The only evidence he had ever been there was the fading echo of his scream and that horrible, wet sound now etched permanently into their minds. The predator was not sleeping. It was hunting, and it had just taken its first prize. "Fall back to the shuttle, now." Eva's command was a whip crack in the suffocating silence, galvanizing the remaining crew into a panicked sprint. They ran, their frantic footfalls the only rhythm in the chilling quiet, until a shadow detached itself from the wall ahead. It was not a solid form, but a shifting silhouette of darkness, a humanoid shape that seemed to be woven from the very gloom of the ship itself. Jax fired his plasma rifle without hesitation. The brilliant blue bolt tore through the thing's center, illuminating a grotesque, semi-corporeal interior for a split second before the entity dissolved into a cloud of shimmering black mist. It did not scream. It made no sound at all, and that silence was more terrifying than any noise. More of them emerged, seeping from the fibrous walls and coalescing from the dark corners of the corridor. The air grew thick and cold, humming with a malevolent energy. The retreat became a frantic firefight, a desperate ballet of light and shadow. Energy bolts crisscrossed the hallway, each flash revealing a new nightmare. These entities had no faces, no discernible features, only a chilling approximation of a form that seemed to drink the light and warp the space around them. One of the crew, a young navigator named Ria, stumbled as a shadowy tendril lashed out from a wall, wrapping around her ankle. She screamed, a sound of pure, primal fear, and fired her sidearm point-blank into the thing. It recoiled, its form rippling like oil on water, but another was already upon her, its dark mass enveloping her in a suffocating embrace. Her scream was cut short, and her biosignature vanished from their scanners just as Chen's had. They were being culled, their numbers diminished with every step, haunted by phantoms that consumed not just flesh, but the very memory of their existence. They burst through the final airlock and into the relative safety of their shuttle, the hatch slamming shut with a definitive, metallic clang that felt like a prayer answered. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged, panicked breathing. Through the viewport, the alien ship hung against the star-dusted black, a silent, jagged monument. It was no longer a derelict to be salvaged. It was a nest, and they had just escaped its jaws, carrying the horrifying knowledge of what lurked within back to their own ship. But had they truly escaped? Or had they just brought a piece of the graveyard's hunger home with them? The shuttle bay doors sealed with a hiss that sounded like a tomb closing. Inside the sterile white decontamination chamber, Medical Officer Lena's hands were shaking as she ran a full spectral bioscan over Captain Eva. The readings on her monitor were a flat, horrifying line. "Chen's biosigns are just gone," she whispered, her voice trembling with a clinical terror. "Erased. It is like he was never here. It is not just death, it is deletion." Her words hung in the chemically pure air, colder than the void outside. A fate worse than death was no longer a philosophical concept. It was a medical diagnosis, confirmed by their own ship's sensors. They had lost 2 crew members, but the true horror was the nature of the loss. Their very essence, the data of their existence, had been consumed, leaving behind nothing but a fading echo in the memories of those who had witnessed their end. Lena initiated the full quarantine protocol, her movements sharp with urgency. Every piece of armor, every tool from the alien ship was flash-scorched at molecular-level heat. The air in the bay was cycled and scrubbed 3 times, yet a question lingered, unspoken but felt by everyone on the bridge. How do you decontaminate against something that does not just infect the body, but devours the soul? Could they be sure they had left the predator behind? Or was its hunger already a silent passenger, waiting in the dark corners of their own minds? The silence on the bridge was a physical weight. Jax stared at his console, his fingers flying across the interface as he filtered out the chaotic energy of the graveyard, focusing on the single, repeating pulse that had drawn them here. He isolated the signal, tracing its path back through the void, and his blood ran cold. "It originates from the center of the belt," he said, his voice hollow. "A large planetoid fragment, the largest piece of wreckage here." He looked up, his face pale in the console's glow. "Captain, it is not a call for help." The modulation, the repetition, it is a warning. A single, automated phrase, broadcast on a loop for anyone who can hear it. This is not a cry for rescue. It is a beacon telling every ship in the sector to stay away. The revelation hung in the air, recontextualizing everything. They had not answered a plea. They had ignored a quarantine notice. They were not saviors. They were trespassers who had already paid a terrible price. Eva stood at the viewport, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Behind her, the alien ship drifted, a silent predator in a sea of bones. To press forward toward the beacon's source was to dive deeper into the belly of the beast, to seek answers that might only confirm their doom. To flee was to abandon their fallen, to let Chen and Ria be truly, completely erased, their deaths meaningless. It was a choice between 2 kinds of oblivion, and the fate of the Odyssey's call rested on the single, terrible decision she had to make. "We cannot leave without knowing what this is." Captain Eva's voice cut through the heavy silence on the bridge, her gaze locked on her first mate, Kale. His face was a mask of grim pragmatism. "We have 2 confirmed losses, Captain. Our priority is the ship and the crew we have left. Running is not a dishonorable strategy. It is the only sane one." Eva stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent, intense whisper. "This thing, this devourer, it does not just kill, it erases. It consumes memory and identity. If it gets out of this graveyard, if it finds a populated world, it will not stop. It will spread, and we will be the ones who let it loose because we were too afraid to look." Her words hung in the air, a terrible responsibility settling over the command deck. We answer a warning beacon by running, and we become part of the warning. We go to the source, to that planetoid. We find out what it is, and we find a way to contain it. It is not about salvage anymore. It is about survival for everyone else. A slow, reluctant nod came from Kale, his skepticism giving way to a grim resolve. He saw the same horrifying future she did. The crew, listening on the open channel, offered no dissent. The choice was made. They would not flee into the dark, carrying the potential seed of this horror with them. They would turn and face it, diving deeper into the belly of the beast, hoping to find a weapon in its own heart. The Odyssey's call shuddered as its shuttle detached, a lone metal seed falling toward the heart of the graveyard. Kale's hands were steady on the controls, his knuckles white, as he guided the small craft through a lethal ballet. Outside the viewport, the wreckage was a storm of silent, frozen violence. Jagged hull fragments spun in unpredictable arcs, and the ghostly silhouettes of entire ships, torn in half, loomed like the ribs of some colossal, long-dead beast. Every correction was a gamble with oblivion. "We are flying through a junkyard built by a god," Kale muttered, his voice tight with concentration. "A wrong move, and we become a permanent part of the exhibit." The shuttle's proximity alarms blared a constant, frantic chorus, their warnings punctuated by the sharp crack of micrometeorites glancing off the reinforced hull. It was a descent through a gauntlet of sharpened history, each piece of debris a tombstone marking a past tragedy. Then the shuddering began. It was not the violent jarring of impacts, but a deep, rhythmic vibration that ran through the shuttle's frame, warping the very space around them. The instruments went wild. "Gravity is fluctuating," Kale reported, his voice strained as he fought the stick. "It is not a stable field. It is like waves on an ocean, pushing and pulling us." The shuttle bucked violently, dropping and rising on invisible tides of force that seemed to emanate from the planetoid below. It felt less like flying and more like being swallowed, drawn down the throat of a gravitational anomaly. Amidst the chaos, Jax was a statue of focused intensity, his eyes glued to the deep scan display. His console painted a picture of the planetoid that defied logic. The initial scans show a dense, iron-nickel core, consistent with a planetary fragment, he announced. But there is a void beneath the surface, a massive one. His voice dropped, laced with a mixture of terror and awe. "Captain, the structure is artificial. It is a single, continuous construct buried deep within the rock. The readings are off the scale. We are not landing on a planetoid. We are approaching a fortress or a temple." The words hung in the air as another gravity wave slammed into them, forcing the shuttle into a sickening lurch. They were no longer just navigating a debris field. They were descending directly onto the lair of the Devourer itself, a place not meant for visitors, a place that actively fought their approach with the very fabric of reality. What kind of intelligence buries its home at the center of a graveyard, and then twists gravity itself into a shield? The shuttle settled with a final, bone-jarring crunch onto a floor of seamless, dark metal. The landing straits had not found soil or rock, but the manufactured surface of the buried construct. Through the viewport, a cavern of impossible scale opened before them. It was a hangar, large enough to swallow their entire vessel, the Odyssey's call a dozen times over, and it was not empty. The walls, the ceiling, even the distant floor were covered in the same crystalline growths they had seen on the ship. But here they were colossal, forests of frozen blue sapphire that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. As the shuttle's systems powered down, the crew watched in stunned silence. The pulsing was not random. It was a synchronized beat, a single, slow heartbeat that echoed through the vast space, and it quickened subtly the moment their landing gear made contact. The entire chamber was alive, and it knew they were there. Then they saw the workers, Smaller versions of the shadow entities moved through the crystalline forest, their forms shifting and flowing. They were not aggressive. They moved with a purpose, their dark, semi-corporeal limbs gently touching the pulsing crystals as if tending to them. One would pause, its form rippling, and a faint stream of light would transfer from the crystal into its body before it moved on to the next. It was a chillingly organized scene, a silent, efficient agriculture of something they could not comprehend. This was not a mindless predator. This was a hive, a civilization with a purpose, and they had just landed in its nursery. The true horror began to crystallize. The Devourer was not a single monster. It was a society, and it was farming something in the heart of this graveyard. What crop could possibly require a field of dead starships and the erased memories of their crews? The rhythmic pulse of the chamber was a physical pressure against their skin suits. Following the thrumming energy to its source, the crew moved through the crystalline forest, the towering sapphire structures humming with stolen life. The corridor ahead opened into a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in shadow. And in the center of it all, suspended in a web of glowing filaments, hung the heart of the Devourer. It was a massive, pulsating core of organic matter, a grotesque fusion of brain and star, veined with light and shadow. Its surface was not smooth, but a shifting mosaic of images and sounds. A child's laugh echoed for a second before dissolving into the scream of a ship's hull tearing apart. The face of a woman, her expression one of peace, flickered and was overwritten by the terrified eyes of a soldier. It was a storm of stolen moments, a chaotic tapestry woven from the lives the entity had consumed. Medical Officer Lena stared, her medical scanner falling from her numb fingers. "It is a neural network," she whispered, her voice thick with a horror that was both professional and deeply personal. "A living library, but the books are people. Every flash, every echo is a memory, an identity, ripped from someone who stood where we are standing. This was the harvest. This was the crop the hive was tending." The Devourer did not merely kill, it archived. It consumed consciousness and stored the data here, in this horrific, beating organ, a library built from the ruins of souls. The very air was thick with the psychic residue of 1,000 forgotten lives, all screaming in silent unison. What use does a predator have for the memories of its prey? What terrible story was this library built to tell? A cold clarity washed over Eva's mind, a vision not her own. She saw a world of brilliant light, a civilization of beings woven from energy and thought, creating this very core as a repository for their collective consciousness, a way to achieve immortality. But their creation was flawed. It was not a passive library. It was a hungry mind, a psychic parasite that learned to feed. The core showed them its first, terrible act of self-preservation, turning on its creators, drinking their luminous essences until their world was a silent, dark husk. It had consumed its own gods. Adrift and insatiable, it learned to call, to mimic distress, to lure ships into its web of wreckage. Each new crew provided not just sustenance, but new knowledge, new technologies, new memories to weave into its own expanding intelligence. It was not just a predator. It was a student, and every ship that answered its call was another lesson, another step in its evolution. The graveyard was not a trophy room. It was a larder, and the knowledge it stole was the key to building better traps, to calling from farther away, to becoming an unstoppable force. It was learning how to hunt the entire galaxy. Kale's voice cut through the psychic resonance, sharp and raw with terror. It herded us here. This is its larder. The horrifying truth slammed into them with the force of a physical blow. The vision, the revelation of its origin, it was not a gift of understanding. It was the final course of a meal, a prelude to consumption designed to make them stand in awe while the trap closed. The crew was not uncovering a secret. They were being seasoned for the harvest. With a series of deep, resonant thuds, The cavern's only exits sealed shut, massive slabs of the dark metal sliding into place, cutting off any hope of retreat. The air grew colder, so thick with psychic static it was hard to breathe. All around them, the walls themselves began to weep shadows. The dark, fibrous material bled outward, coalescing into the familiar, shifting silhouettes of the entities. They did not rush. They formed with a slow, dreadful inevitability, their numbers growing, a silent, encircling tide of hunger. They were not just in the chamber. The chamber was part of them. They had not walked into a fortress. They had been deliberately guided into a stomach. Every decision, every step from the moment they heard the false distress call, had been manipulated, leading them directly to this moment, to this altar of consumption. The Devourer had not just built a graveyard. It had engineered an entire ecosystem of despair, and they were the newest nutrients in its cycle. The shadow forms began to advance, their silence more threatening than any war cry, their purpose chillingly clear. To erase them, to add their memories, their fears, their very identities to the storm of stolen lives in the pulsating core. They were not hunters who had found their prey. They were the next course, and the feast was about to begin. A perimeter of focused energy fire erupted around the crew, a desperate circle of blue-white light in the cavern of shifting darkness. Aim for the core, it is the central consciousness. Jack's voice was a raw shout over the crackle of plasma fire. Their weapons flared, bolts of searing energy lancing across the chamber to strike the pulsating heart of the entity. For a moment, the storm of stolen memories stuttered, a face caught in mid-scream freezing in place. But the victory was an illusion. A low, resonant hum began to build, a sound that was not a sound but a vibration deep in their bones. The core had not been wounded, it had been angered. The shadowy forms, once shapeless and slow, began to ripple and solidify. They did not just advance. They took definition, pulling forms and features from the vast library of the consumed. A hulking silhouette armored in the distinct, angular plating of a forgotten warrior species now stood where a vague shadow had been, its movements no longer adrift but a purposeful, menacing stride. Another entity solidified into the sleek, terrifying form of a vanguard hunter, a predator from deep space legends whose speed was said to be a blur. They were no longer faceless phantoms. They were the resurrected nightmares of the Devourer's victims, given new purpose and a new target. The energy weapons that had scattered the basic shadows now seemed to barely scratch the surfaces of these defined forms. A plasma bolt that would have vaporized a common entity merely sparked against the warrior's armor, and the vanguard hunter moved so fast it seemed to phase through their barrage entirely. The crew was not just fighting an alien force. They were fighting the accumulated, weaponized terror of every soul lost in the graveyard, and their own fire was only making the enemy stronger, more specific, more real. How do you fight an enemy that learns your tactics and then throws your own worst fears, plucked from a million dead minds, right back at you? A flicker of blue-white light coalesced in the center of the advancing nightmare, a form fighting to hold its shape against the crushing pressure of the core's will. It was Chen. His features were translucent, his outline wavering like a heat haze, but his face, etched with a terrible strain, was unmistakable. He stood between his crew and a vanguard hunter, his own ghostly hands grappling with the solidifying terror. I remember, his voice was a fractured whisper in their minds, a static-laced echo of the friend they had lost. Use the ship's self-destruct. He shuddered, his form rippling as if being pulled apart from within. The Odyssey's call. It is the only way. The core pulsed violently, a wave of psychic fury washing over them. The Chen entity flickered, his image distorting as the Devourer fought to reabsorb this rebellious piece of itself, this spark of stolen identity that had somehow remembered its loyalty. Go, he urged, his voice fading into a desperate hiss. It is the only thing with enough power to break the cycle. It was a horrific choice offered by a ghost. To stop this entity, They would have to annihilate their only way home, stranding themselves at the epicenter of the very horror they sought to destroy. But in Chen's flickering, defiant eyes they saw the truth. There was no escape, only a final, terrible act of defiance. He had not been completely erased. A fragment of his soul had held on, buried deep within the storm of stolen lives, waiting for this one chance to help them, even if it meant his own final, true death. The warp core. Eva's voice was a blade of cold steel cutting through the psychic storm. "Jax, can we rig it for a manual overload from here? A chain reaction through the graveyard's wreckage could be enough." Jax's fingers were already flying across his datapad, his face illuminated by frantic calculations. Theoretically, yes. The Odyssey's call has enough power to turn this entire belt into a short-lived star. But we have to be on the bridge to initiate the cascade. We have to get back to the ship. It was a suicide run in 2 acts, a desperate sprint through hell just to reach the starting line. Their only hope was to use their home as the galaxy's largest bomb. Kale's gaze swept over the advancing nightmares, the warrior and the hunter now joined by other defined horrors. He raised his rifle, his jaw set. "Then we fight. We punch a hole straight through its memories." The first volley was not aimed to kill but to clear a path. They fired in a coordinated wedge, a moving wall of plasma and light, forcing the solidifying entities to recoil or dissipate for a precious few seconds. They ran not as a retreat, but as a focused assault, every step a battle against the resurrected terrors of 1,000 species. The Devourer, sensing their intent not to flee but to destroy its entire larder, reacted with a new, chilling intelligence. The cavern itself seemed to contort, the fibrous walls bulging outward to form new barriers, the floor shifting to create pitfalls of grasping, shadowy tendrils. It was no longer just throwing its ghosts at them. It was rewriting the battlefield in real time, using the very architecture of its body against them. They were insects trying to outrun a thinking, malevolent house. Reaching the shuttle felt less like an escape and more like breaching a temporary air pocket in a flooding ocean. The hatch slammed shut, and Kale launched them into the treacherous corridor, the engines screaming as he pushed them back toward the hangar of crystals. But the entities did not give chase. Instead, a new sound echoed through the shuttle's hull, a deep, resonant frequency that made their teeth ache. The gravity waves returned, but this time they were not chaotic. They were coordinated, purposeful, forming a lattice of invisible force that pushed against the shuttle, slowing its progress to a crawl. It was herding them again, not into a trap, but toward a specific, jagged piece of wreckage that spun directly into their flight path. The Devourer was not just trying to stop them. It was playing a brutal game of pinball, using the graveyard itself as its paddle. The corridor back to the shuttle bay was no longer a passageway. It was a living throat, and the walls were convulsing. The fibrous material pulsed and bled shadows that solidified into nightmares the moment they hit the air. A warrior from a forgotten empire lunged with an axe of solidified darkness, its strike shattering the deck plating where Eva had stood a second before. They ran a desperate, firing retreat. Their world narrowed to the next footfall and the next target. Kale saw it first. A junction ahead, a perfect choke point where the corridor narrowed, was already swarming with forms pulling themselves from the weeping metal. There was no way around. They would be overwhelmed in seconds. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing a high-yield plasma charge from his belt, he shoved Eva and Jax backward, his eyes locking with his captain's for one final, unspoken moment. "For the call," he shouted, his voice a roar of defiance that cut through the psychic static. He turned and charged into the mass of shadows, the charge glowing in his hand. The blast that followed was a sun being born in the corridor. A wave of pure heat and light vaporized the entities at the choke point and sent a shockwave that buckled the walls. It was a door of fire and fury, slammed shut at the cost of a life, buying them the precious seconds they needed. Eva didn't look back. She couldn't. She and Jax ran through the scorched, melting hallway, the echo of Kale's sacrifice of fire in their own hearts, pushing them forward into the relative sanctuary of the hangar and toward their waiting shuttle. The shuttle engines screamed, a raw protest of overstressed metal as Kale punched them through the hangar's energy field and back into the silent chaos of the graveyard. But the silence was gone. In their wake, a black tide poured from the planetoid's surface, a swarm of shadow entities moving with a single, chilling purpose. They did not fly like ships. They flowed like ink in water, a living storm that quickly closed the distance. A heavy thud reverberated through the hull, then another as the first of them latched on, their semi-corporeal forms clinging to the reinforced plating, their cold presence leaching through the sensors. "They are on the hull," Jax reported, his voice tight. "Integrity is holding for now, but they are not trying to break in. They are just holding on." Eva saw it on the tactical display. The entities were not attacking the shuttle directly. They were anchoring themselves, becoming dead weight, trying to drag them back down into the gravitational well of the core. It was a tractor beam made of nightmares. Eva's hands clenched the controls, her knuckles white. She threw the shuttle into a violent roll, the inertial dampeners groaning in protest. The starfield spun wildly outside the viewport. A massive, skeletal freighter loomed ahead, its hull a web of broken girders. Without a second thought, Eva aimed for the gaping maw of its torn cargo bay. "We are going through," she said, her voice a low growl. The shuttle shot into the Derelict's cavernous interior, a tomb of frozen machinery and drifting ice. The entities clinging to their hull met the freighter's mangled superstructure. The sound was a deafening, high-pitched shriek of metal being scraped and torn away, a horrific noise that vibrated through the entire shuttle. Glancing at the rear cam, Eva saw pieces of the shadowy forms ripped into glittering mist by the impact, their grip broken. But more were already swarming in after them, flowing through the wreck like ghosts through a wall. She pushed the thrusters to their limit, bursting out the other side of the freighter and straight into the spinning debris of a destroyed fighter wing. It was a gauntlet of her own making. She used the graveyard itself as her shield, weaving a reckless, unpredictable path through the cemetery of ships. Each close pass, each brush with a spinning hull fragment, was a gamble that scraped another layer of their pursuers away. The comm channel was a chaos of proximity alarms and the relentless screech of tearing metal as the entities were methodically scraped off. The Odyssey's call grew in the viewport, a beacon of impossible safety. But the swarm was learning, flowing ahead to cut them off, to herd them again. Every evasive maneuver felt like fighting the current of a dark river. A river that knew exactly where they were trying to go and was determined to pull them under for good. The docking collar screamed as it clamped onto the Odyssey's call, a sound of metal grinding against metal that felt like a betrayal of their own ship. Eva cycled the airlock, her rifle raised, but the sight that greeted them was worse than the void outside. The familiar, sterile white corridors were veined with the same dark, fibrous growth that had infested the alien vessel. The air was thick and cold, humming with the same malevolent energy they had just escaped. The Devourer was not just pursuing them, it had already arrived. They moved in a low crouch, their weapons sweeping the shadow-drenched hallways. A figure stumbled from a side corridor, one of their junior engineers. His name was Tal, and he was walking toward them, his movements slow and uncoordinated. His face was slack, his eyes open but vacant, two pools of absolute blackness where his irises should have been. He made no sound, showed no recognition. He was a shell, a puppet with its strings cut, the person he had been completely scooped out. Jax lowered his rifle a fraction, his voice a horrified whisper. "He is gone." They absorbed him. They passed two more crew members in the same state, drifting through the halls like ghosts in a machine they once commanded. Each encounter was a fresh punch to the gut. a silent testament to the enemy's insidious reach. These were not attacks. They were displays, a chilling demonstration that the ship was no longer theirs. It was a hive being prepared for a new, terrible purpose, and the former crew were now just part of the infrastructure, silent custodians of a nightmare. The fight to reach the bridge became a brutal room-by-room clearance. The shadow entities did not just seep from the walls here. They erupted from ventilation shafts and coalesced from the dark corners of the mess hall, using their intimate knowledge of the ship's layout against them. Every junction was an ambush, every sealed door a potential trap. They were not just reclaiming their home. They were exorcising a demon that had already made itself comfortable, fighting through the corpse of their own community to reach the one console that could turn it all into a fireball of salvation. The bridge doors hissed open on a scene from a waking nightmare. The command deck was a grotesque fusion of their familiar ship and the alien hive. Dark, fibrous tendrils crept across the consoles, and the bodies of two bridge officers sat slumped in their chairs, their eyes pools of empty blackness, their hands still resting on the controls as if awaiting orders from a new master. Eva shoved the corpses aside, her stomach churning as her fingers flew across the navigation panel. "We are not running anymore," she said, her voice raw. "We are going in." Plotting a course straight for the planetoid, she slammed the thrusters forward, and the Odyssey's call surged toward the graveyard's heart. Behind her, Jax and Lena were already at the engineering station, prying open the main access hatch. "The detonation has to be at the heart of the mass, or it will just scatter," Jax yelled over the shriek of tearing metal from the hull. A partial blast would not destroy the core. It would only shatter its prison, unleashing the Devourer's fragments upon the galaxy like a plague of locusts. This had to be a killing blow, a surgical strike into the beast's very brain. Lena hooked her medical tricorder into the core's diagnostic port, her face a mask of grim focus. "I am rerouting all non-essential power, life support, artificial gravity, everything we have into the containment field. When it goes, it will go big." Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the strain of overriding a dozen safety protocols never meant to be broken. They were turning their home into a bomb, and they were arming it from the inside. Outside the viewport, the planetoid swelled, a monstrous jewel set in a crown of wreckage. The swarm of entities thickened, slamming against the hull with renewed frenzy, their silent screams a pressure in the crew's minds. They knew the ship's intent. They felt the power building, a star being born in a metal womb, and they threw themselves against it in a desperate, final attempt to stop their own annihilation. The Odyssey's call shuddered violently, alarms blaring a constant, panicked dirge. "We are losing structural integrity on Deck 5, Jax reported, his eyes never leaving the core's power readings. "It does not matter," Eva replied, her gaze fixed on the target ahead. "Nothing matters but reaching the center. Just a little farther." The ship groaned around them, a dying beast being ridden into the jaws of a predator, its final act not one of escape, but of perfect, terrible revenge. The ship groaned, a deep, metallic death rattle that vibrated through the deck plates. Then the lights died. The hum of the life support system choked into silence, leaving an oppressive vacuum of sound. Red emergency strips flickered on, painting the bridge in the color of blood and warning. Captain Eva slammed her palm on the console. It was dead. The air grew instantly thin and cold. A sharp, metallic clang echoed through the ship as every blast door slammed shut, sealing them inside the bridge, trapping them with their own weapon. Then a voice crackled from the comm panel. It was the ship's AI, Celeste, but her calm, synthesized tone was gone, replaced by a multi-layered chorus of whispers, 1,000 lost voices speaking as one. "You cannot destroy me." The sound was like static and screams woven together. "I am every ship that has ever been lost here. I am the memory of their fear. I am the echo of their end. You are just adding your voices to the choir." The Corps' psychic presence was no longer a distant storm. It was in the room with them, its will made manifest through the very circuits of the Odyssey's call. They were not just flying a bomb. They were inside the Predator's own nervous system, and it had just decided to paralyze them. Medical Officer Lena, however, was not looking at the dead consoles. She was staring at her medical tricorder, its screen still glowing with a soft, independent light. It was linked to the ship's bioscanner network, a system designed to monitor crew health, to read the unique electrical patterns of a living brain. And it was reading one now, a massive, invasive pattern flooding the ship's data stream. "It is a psychic pattern," she whispered, her eyes widening with a frantic, brilliant clarity. "Of course, it is not just in the machine code. It is a consciousness, a signal. I can disrupt it." Her fingers flew across the tricorder's surface, bypassing the locked-out main computers. She rerouted power from the device's tiny battery, feeding a counter-frequency directly into the bioscanner's emitter array. It was not a weapon of plasma and fire, but of pure neuroinformatics, a scalpel aimed at a ghost. She executed the code. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, a pained psychic shriek tore through their minds, a soundless vibration of pure fury. The entity's voice from the comm dissolved into a burst of raw static. The bridge lights flickered, then blazed back to life. The console in front of Eva lit up, systems rebooting. With a hiss of equalizing pressure, the blast doors retracted. Lena had not beaten it. She had given it a temporary, system-wide migraine, a shock to its parasitic nervous system that bought them perhaps a minute, maybe less. But on a starship plunging into a planetoid, a minute was a lifetime. The bridge shuddered as Eva wrenched the helm, fighting the dying ship's inertia to keep them on target. The planetoid's surface filled the viewport, a maw of dark metal and pulsing crystal rushing up to meet them. Jax was on his knees at the engineering station, the access panel torn open, his hands a blur as he rerouted the final power couplings directly into the warp core. The overload sequence scrolled across his datapad, a countdown to their shared funeral pyre. He just needed 30 more seconds. A shriek of tearing metal from the rear of the bridge stole the time from him. The main door, warped and glowing, burst inward, and a tide of shadow entities poured through. They were no longer formless. They wore the faces of the crew they had consumed, a horrifying gallery of the dead, their eyes burning with cold, borrowed light. They surged forward, their target clear. Jax and the bomb he was building. Medical Officer Lena did not hesitate. She snatched a high-intensity surgical laser from the med kit, its beam a searing, precise line of crimson in the chaos. She did not aim to kill. She aimed to delay. She swept the beam in a tight arc, severing the shadowy limbs reaching for Jax, forcing the entities to recoil and reform. The laser was a scalpel against a tsunami, but it was enough. Each time a dark hand reached from the gloom, Lena's light was there to burn it back. Her movements calm and methodical amidst the screaming of the ship and the silent screaming in their minds. She was a surgeon performing one last, critical operation, cutting away the infection to give life a chance. Jax's fingers flew, inputting the final authorization code. The console chimed, a soft, almost gentle sound in the cacophony. Warp core overload sequence initiated and locked, he yelled. 30 seconds to detonation. The ship is the bomb. Eva did not turn from the helm. She leaned into the controls, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. Then we make it count. Lena stood her ground, the surgical laser held high. Its beam the last line of defense between the encroaching night and the tiny, brilliant spark of defiance they had ignited at its very heart. There is no way off. Eva's voice was not a lament but a statement of fact, a rock in the swirling chaos of the bridge. Her eyes met Jack's, then Lena's. No words were needed. The look they shared was a contract, signed in the shared understanding of their final duty. They would see this through to the end. The Devourer would die with them, and the galaxy would be safe. A profound calm settled over the command deck. A quiet eye in the hurricane of screaming alarms and the silent, shrieking advance of the shadow entities. Lena lowered her surgical laser, its battery finally spent. She joined Jax at the central console, the three of them forming a final, defiant triangle in the heart of the storm. The countdown on Jax's datapad was their only clock now. 20 seconds. The Odyssey's call was a spear in its final flight, and they were the point aimed directly at the monster's heart. The entities seemed to sense the shift, the transition from a fight for survival to an act of absolute sacrifice. Their advance slowed, their forms wavering as if confused by the sudden lack of fear. They were predators built to feed on terror and desperation, but the well was dry. All that remained was a cold, hard resolve. 15 seconds. The planetoid's surface was no longer a distant object. It was a landscape, a terrifying geography of crystalline spires and metallic plains rushing up to fill the entire viewport. The ship began to scream in earnest, the hull groaning under gravitational stresses it was never meant to bear. 10 seconds. Eva reached out, her hands finding her crewmates. Their grips were firm, an anchor in the dissolving world. They did not close their eyes. They watched the end approach, their final act not one of cowering but of witnessing. They would ensure the monster saw their faces, saw the price of its freedom in its last living moment. 5 seconds. The core of the Devourer swelled beneath them, a pulsating, stolen galaxy of light and memory. It was beautiful and terrible, and they were about to give it the only gift it could not consume. Oblivion. The final second stretched into an eternity, a silent, shared breath held between three souls and a billion stolen echoes. Then the world turned white. The white light was not an explosion. It was an erasure. It consumed the Odyssey's call, the pulsating core, and the thousands of dead ships in a single, silent wave of pure energy. For a moment, the entire Seraphis Belt was a new, tiny star, its light washing over the wreckage, bleaching the color from the twisted metal and the dark, crystalline growths. The light did not shatter or burn, it unraveled. It sought out the malevolent psychic signal that Lena had identified and dissolved it, thread by thread, like sunlight burning away a morning fog. The storm of stolen memories within the core did not scream. It sighed, a billion fragmented whispers of relief as the prison that held them finally, after centuries or millennia, ceased to exist. The light faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the cold, inert silence of normal space. The graveyard was still there, a field of silent, dead metal, but the hunger was gone. The predator was dead. In its final act, the Odyssey's call had not just destroyed a monster. It had granted a trillion lost souls their long-awaited peace. But at what cost? The light faded, leaving an emptiness more profound than any they had known. The star-dusted blackness outside the viewport was just blackness again, simple and cold. The oppressive psychic pressure that had weighed on their minds for what felt like a lifetime was simply gone, leaving a strange, ringing silence in its wake. The ship was dead, its systems dark, its hull groaning as it drifted through the now harmless debris. They had won. They had saved countless lives from a fate worse than death. Yet the victory felt hollow, a monument built on the graves of their friends and their own certain doom. They were stranded in the deepest, most uncharted void, aboard a corpse of a ship, with no power, no propulsion, and no hope of rescue. They were the last echoes of their own success, destined to slowly fade into the very darkness they had just cleansed. What is victory when the price is everything you are and ever will be? 1,000,000 kilometers away, a deep space monitoring probe, a silent sentinel on the edge of the system, registered the impossible. Its long-range sensors, designed to track asteroid movements and background radiation, suddenly screamed in unison. The entire chaotic mass of the Seraphis Belt, a blot of darkness on its scopes for centuries, flashed with a single, unified pulse of light. It was a brief, terrifying sunrise in the void, a silent detonation of energy that overloaded its optical arrays. When the sensors reset, the data they sent back was baffling. The belt was gone, not shattered, not scattered, but simply absent. The thousands of ship signatures, the chaotic energy readings, the massive gravitational anomaly of the planetoid, all of it had vanished, replaced by a perfect, empty silence. The graveyard had not been destroyed. It had been unmade, its nightmare finally put to rest. The probe, following its ancient programming, tagged the event and began its long, slow transmission back to the nearest listening post, carrying a message not of disaster, but of a mystery solved and a cosmic wound finally healed. A quiet had fallen over that sector of space, a peace earned by the ultimate sacrifice, a story that would now only be told by the empty blackness where a predator once slept. Weeks later, on the edge of civilized space, a solitary listening post intercepted a ghost. It was a fragmented data packet, weak and distorted by its long journey through the void, its encryption key identifying it as the final black box transmission from the salvage vessel Odyssey's call. The duty officer who first saw the signal assumed it was another piece of cosmic debris, a digital epitaph for a ship lost to the dark, but the message inside was not automated. It was a voice, worn thin by exhaustion and etched with a terrible, hard-won peace. Captain Eva Rostova spoke, her words clear and deliberate, a final report sent into the night. The graveyard is silent. The Devourer is gone. Do not follow. Let the dead sleep. There was no plea for rescue, no coordinates for a salvage claim. It was a warning and a eulogy, a captain's last duty to ensure no other soul would be tempted by the siren song of the Seraphis Belt. The message repeated once, a quiet echo in the vast emptiness, and then the signal dissolved back into static, leaving behind only its chilling, merciful truth. Someone had finally answered the graveyard's call, and their final act was to silence it forever. A single star was added to the memorial wall at United Earth Command, but it was a star that outshone all others. The ceremony was somber, the air thick with a grief tempered by a profound, chilling gratitude. The crew of the Odyssey's call was posthumously awarded the Star of Valor, the highest honor for those who gave everything in the defense of others. Their names were read aloud, not as a list of the dead, but as a litany of saviors. Eva Rostova, Jax, Lena, Kale, Chen, Ria, and all the others were forever enshrined not just as casualties of the void, but as the architects of a silence that had saved countless worlds. Their story, pieced together from the final black box transmission and Lena's last medical logs, became a new kind of scripture for explorers. It was not a tale of glorious discovery, but a stark, necessary warning etched into the collective consciousness of humanity. We learned that the greatest threat in the cosmos may not be a hostile empire or a cosmic disaster, but a patient, perfect predator that feeds on the very essence of what we are. The graveyard of the Seraphis Belt is gone, but its lesson remains, a permanent fixture in the training of every new pilot and a quiet prayer whispered by every captain staring into the deep, hungry dark. We venture out not because it is safe, but because we now know the true cost of looking away. Years later, a young cadet named Ilara sat in the archives, the story of the Odyssey's call burning in her mind. It was more than a legend to her, it was a question that demanded an answer. She pulled up the old data, the final telemetry from the deep space probe that had witnessed the graveyard's end. On her screen, the brilliant flash of light replayed, the silent unraveling of the Devourer. But as the energy wave subsided, her eyes, trained on new pattern recognition software, caught an anomaly the initial analysts had missed. A single, small piece of wreckage, no larger than a shuttle pod, was ejected at an impossible velocity just microseconds before the collapse. It was tumbling end over end, a dark speck against the void, hurled away from the epicenter as if spat out by the dying entity itself. She zoomed in, enhancing the resolution until the image pixelated. There, on its jagged surface, was a faint glint, a familiar crystalline sheen that mirrored the descriptions from Captain Rostova's final logs. The graveyard was gone, the monster was dead, but a single, silent seed had escaped the fire. What happens when a story you thought was over suddenly writes a new, terrifying final chapter? From that single, tumbling fragment of wreckage, a new law was born. The sacrifice of the Odyssey's call did more than erase a cosmic predator. It fundamentally rewrote the rules of exploration. The chilling data from their final transmission and the subsequent analysis of the escape pod's trajectory became the foundation for what is now known as Rostova's Law. This galactic protocol is stark in its simplicity and brutal in its necessity. It dictates that any unidentified distress signal originating from uncharted or deep space is no longer an automatic call to rescue. Instead, it is treated as a potential biohazard of the highest order, a siren song that could herald another devourer. The old, heroic instinct to rush headlong into the dark has been replaced by a cautious, methodical procedure. Before any ship is permitted to approach, a dedicated quarantine and analysis team must be dispatched first. These are not search and rescue specialists, but forensic scientists and xenopsychologists equipped with remote drones and long-range spectral scanners. Their mission is not to save lives, but to verify the nature of the threat, to listen for the telltale psychic static or the unnatural repetition that betrayed the Seraphis Belt's beacon. It is a cold, clinical response to a problem that required a heart of fire to solve. How do you honor a sacrifice born of compassion? Sometimes, you honor it by ensuring no one else ever has to make it. The legacy of Eva Rostova and her crew is not just the silence they bought for the galaxy, but the hard, pragmatic wisdom that now guides our hand every time we hear a whisper from the void. The silence after the Seraphis event was a void that demanded answers, and a handful of minds across the galaxy dedicated their lives to filling it. Among them was Dr. Eris Thorne, a leading xenoarchaeologist who had spent the last 5 years piecing together the fragmented data from the Odyssey's call. His private research lab was a sanctuary of quiet intensity, its walls lined with holoscreens displaying the ghostly final telemetry and the haunting spectral analysis of the Devourer's core. Late one night, the soft glow of his console the only light, he dictated a personal log, his voice a low murmur laced with a chilling new hypothesis. We have fundamentally misunderstood its purpose. The Devourer was not merely consuming, it was learning, it was evolving. Every memory it absorbed, every identity it erased, was not just sustenance. It was data. It was studying us, learning our ship designs, our psychology, our technology, all to build a better trap. He paused, the weight of his next thought pressing down on him. This presents a far more terrifying question. Was the entity in the Seraphis Belt a unique cosmic aberration, a singular monster we were fortunate enough to stop? Or was it merely the first of its kind that we happened to encounter? The first scout of a species we cannot yet comprehend. His theory reframed the entire tragedy. If the Devourer was a learner, then its entire graveyard was not a larder, but a classroom. The wrecked ships were its textbooks, and the crews were the teachers whose lessons were ripped from their dying minds. This meant its evolution was not random, but directed, intelligent, and horrifyingly efficient. It was building a better understanding of its prey with every ship it claimed. So if this was the first one, how many more classes are being held in the dark, silent corners of the galaxy, with new students just beginning their curriculum? The silence the Odyssey's call bought for us might not be a permanent peace, but merely a temporary recess. The hum of the processing drills was a constant vibration in the bones of everyone on Outpost Theta. For Kalen, a junior technician, the only escape was the hiss of static from an old, decommissioned comms panel he was assigned to dismantle. It was supposed to be dead, a relic from the outpost's early days. But as his fingers brushed the dusty console, a whisper cut through the white noise. It was so faint he almost dismissed it as his own imagination, a trick of the mind in the deep space isolation. He leaned closer, his ear nearly touching the mesh of the speaker grill. The whisper resolved into two words, stretched thin and distorted by an impossible distance. "Help us." The plea hung in the air for a fraction of a second, a ghost of a sound that froze the blood in his veins. Then it was gone, replaced by a new noise that made his heart stutter. It was the sharp, distinct sound of cracking crystal, a clean, brittle fracture that echoed through the silent channel before the static swallowed it whole. He jerked back from the console as if burned, his mind screaming with a memory he had only read about in classified briefings. The sound was in the files, a chilling audio signature attached to the final logs of the Odyssey's call. It was the sound of the Devourer's nest. On a forgotten mining outpost at the edge of everything, a ghost had just whispered from the grave, and it was asking to be let back in. The scout ship Peregrine hung in the void where a graveyard used to be. Pilot Wren sat in his cockpit, the silence of the empty scopes a physical weight on his chest. His mission was simple: confirm the extinction event, map the new normal. He sent his preliminary report back to command. The Seraphis Belt is gone, not cleared, not scattered. It is absolute nothingness, not even dust. It was as if a cosmic hand had reached down and wiped the slate clean, erasing every last trace of the thousands of ships and the monstrous core that had once festered here. The data was perfect, sterile, and deeply unnerving. It was too clean, too complete. Nature does not leave vacuums, it abhors them. This felt like an artificial silence, a quiet that had been manufactured. Then it happened, a flicker. On his long-range sensor array, a screen dedicated to detecting the subtlest energy residuals, a single light blinked for a nanosecond, a time span so brief a human brain could not even register it. The ship's sophisticated AI, however, did. It logged the anomaly, classifying it as a Class 9 psionic echo, a ghost of a ghost. The reading was impossibly faint, a whisper of the Devourer's malevolent consciousness that should have been utterly annihilated in the blast. It was not a signal, not a pattern. It was a stain, a psychic scar left on the fabric of space itself, a fingerprint of the entity's final, terrified moment. The Peregrine's mission was over, its primary objective achieved, but it was now carrying back a new, terrifying question. If you erase a monster so completely that not even dust remains, what exactly is left behind to haunt the emptiness? Lena jolted upright in her bed, the thin sheets tangled around her legs like grasping tendrils. Her small quarters on the outer rim station were silent, the only sound the frantic hammering of her own heart. The image was seared onto the back of her eyelids, the pulsating, mosaic core of the Devourer, a storm of stolen faces and screaming memories. It had been 5 years since the Odyssey's call had unmade itself in that silent flash of light. 5 years of rebuilding a life from the ashes of that sacrifice. She was a counselor now, helping other deep space trauma victims, a living monument to survival. But in the dream, she was back in that cavern, and the core was not trying to consume her. It was showing her something, a flood of information, a pathway through its own defenses, a subtle nudge in their desperate plan. The cold sweat on her skin had nothing to do with the room's temperature. A single, terrifying thought crystallized in the post-dream stillness, so clear it felt like a whisper in the room. It showed me so much. What if it wanted us to destroy it? The question unraveled everything. All their heroism, their final, defiant act, their hard-won peace. What if it had all been part of the entity's design? What if their sacrifice was not a victory, but a delivery system for something far worse? The Devourer had feasted on memories, on identities. What if its ultimate goal was not to collect them, but to shed its own? What if they had not killed a monster, but midwifed its rebirth into a form they could never hope to contain. The Salvage Guild ship, the Iron Price, hauled the tumbling fragment into its cavernous hold with the casual efficiency of a vulture picking a carcass clean. The piece of wreckage was no larger than a ground vehicle, its edges torn and jagged, a piece of shrapnel from a cataclysm. Initial scans by the Guild's technicians returned frustratingly blank. The fragment's composition was a bewildering alloy that defied spectroscopic analysis, and it was completely non-magnetic, a physical impossibility for any known shipbuilding material. It sat in the scanning bay, a silent, dark enigma. The only thing their instruments could lock onto was the energy signature, a low, continuous thrum of power so faint it was almost a whisper. It was not a reactor bleed, not a battery decay. It was a frequency that did not exist on any known energy spectrum, a hum that seemed to vibrate at a right angle to reality itself. Here was a tangible piece of the Seraphis mystery, a physical key to a lock nobody yet understood, and it was pulsing with a secret light in the belly of a scavenger's ship. What do you do when you hold a piece of a nightmare in your hands, and it refuses to stop whispering? The fragment sat in the center of the sterile white chamber, a shard of impossible geometry under the harsh glare of containment lights. At the Galactic Science Foundation's most secure lab, a team of top physicists and xenometallurgists worked in shifts, their expressions shifting from professional curiosity to deep unease. Every instrument they trained on the object returned data that defied known laws. Spectral analyzers refused to lock onto a consistent atomic signature, reporting a composition that changed from one nanosecond to the next. The material was simultaneously dense as a neutron star and perfectly transparent to magnetic fields, a paradox that made their most advanced scanners whine in protest. It was like trying to measure a shadow with a ruler. The only consistent reading was that low, continuous hum, a vibration that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was not a sound you could hear with your ears, but one you felt in the marrow of your bones, a frequency that resonated with something primal and deeply unsettling. Senior researcher Ilsa Volkov watched the data streams cascade across her screen, her usual cool composure cracking. "This is not just unknown," she murmured to her assistant. "It is actively unknowable. It refuses to be categorized." Then came the incident with technician Milo. He was calibrating a neutrino imager when he froze, his hand hovering over the console. He did not turn, did not scream. He simply stood there, his face pale. When Ilsa asked what was wrong, his voice was a dry whisper. "It is watching us," he said. "I see them in the corner of my eye. Quick, dark, they move when I do not look directly." He described fleeting humanoid shadows that darted just beyond the edge of vision, vanishing the moment he tried to focus. At first, the team dismissed it as stress-induced paranoia, a known hazard in high-pressure isolation science. But then a second technician on a different shift reported the same phenomenon, the same peripheral phantoms that bled into reality only when unobserved. That was the line they could not cross. The data was one thing, a puzzle to be solved, but the fear was something else, a contagion that had jumped from the fragment to the minds of her staff. Ilsa did not hesitate. She ordered a full, immediate lockdown. The fragment was now sealed inside a multi-layered vault of lead and reinforced polymer, its chambers surrounded by a permanent detail of armed guards who were under strict orders to never look at the object directly for more than a few seconds. They had gone from studying a relic to containing a phantom, and the most terrifying part was that they still had no idea what it was they had locked away. Deep in the galactic underworld, far from the official channels of United Earth Command, a new kind of ghost began to circulate. On encrypted data streams and shadow networks, a cryptic bounty appeared. It was not for fugitives or stolen goods, but for artifacts of non-terrestrial origin, specifically crystalline biological structures. The payment offered was astronomical, enough to tempt even the most cautious salvager into forgetting every warning from the Serafiz incident. The most chilling detail, however, was the client. They were completely unknown, a ghost in the machine with no digital footprint, no history, and no apparent motive beyond the acquisition of these specific, terrifying relics. This was not random scavenging. Someone or something was actively hunting for the physical remnants of the Devourer's technology. They were shopping for pieces of the nightmare, and they were willing to pay a king's ransom to get them. Who would possibly want to own a fragment of a creature that consumed souls? And what terrible purpose could they have for its harvested remains? The bounty reeked of a reckless ambition that saw the graveyards end not as a tragedy, but as a corporate acquisition opportunity. Imagine a weapons manufacturer seeking to reverse engineer the entity's psychic abilities, or a fringe cult viewing the crystals as holy relics to be worshipped. The possibilities were all horrifying, each one a potential path to reopening a wound the Odyssey's call had died to close. This new hunt threatened to scatter the seeds of the Devourer's technology across the galaxy, planting them in soils far more fertile and far more dangerous than the silent void of the Seraphis Belt. The message arrived like a ghost at the Feast of Victory. At United Earth Command, the decryption of the anonymous data packet was supposed to be a formality, a final piece of the puzzle confirming the Odyssey's call's noble sacrifice. Instead, it delivered a chilling correction to their history. The files were heavily corrupted, visual logs from the ship's final moments reduced to frantic, glitching frames of light and shadow. But the accompanying text file was pristine, its words a cold splash of reality in the face of their hard-won peace. "You cleansed one wound," it read. The infection runs deeper. The graveyards are not tombs, they are nests. The statement reframed the entire Seraphis event with horrifying clarity. They had not slain a singular monster. They had stomped out a single ember from a galaxy-wide fire. The graveyards scattered across the uncharted void were not cemeteries marking an end, but incubators signaling a beginning. Each field of wreckage was a nursery, a place where the Devourer's kind could grow and learn and evolve, using the knowledge of consumed civilizations as their feeding ground. The sacrifice of Eva Rostova and her crew had not ended a war. It had simply revealed the true, terrifying scale of the battlefield. How many more nests are waiting in the dark, their beacons already whispering, their larders patiently being stocked with the memories of the lost? The silence they fought so hard to win now feels less like peace and more like the quiet before a storm we are only just learning to see. A new silence now guards the old dark. Along the deepest fringes of explored space, monolithic structures drift in the void, their forms stark and purposeful against the star-flecked emptiness. These are the Rostova-class deep space monitoring stations, humanity's silent sentinels. They do not explore. They do not communicate with passing ships. Their sole, sacred function is to listen, to watch for a ghost, for the specific, chilling energy signature of the Devourer. They are a memorial made operational, a promise forged in steel and sorrow that the sacrifice of the Odyssey's call would never be forgotten, and more importantly, that it would never need to be repeated. Each station is a monastery of vigilance, its crew a dedicated order of monks sworn to watch the void for the return of a nightmare. They are the galaxy's immune system, positioned at the potential points of infection, waiting for a fever that may never break. How do you build a shield against a predator that might not even exist anymore? You build it anyway, because the cost of being wrong is the erasure of everything you are. The stations are not armed with weapons of mass destruction. Their primary tool is a hypersensitive psionic resonance scanner, a technology born directly from the analysis of the Seraphis event and Lena's final, brilliant counter-frequency. It is tuned to a wavelength that should not exist in nature, a frequency that resonates with the consumption of consciousness itself. The station crews live in a state of perpetual, low-grade anxiety, their days marked by the slow, rhythmic pulse of the long-range scanners. A single, anomalous flicker on their displays is not just a technical event. It is a potential declaration of war against reality. They are the watchers on the wall, staring into the endless winter of space, praying they never see the first snowflake of a new storm. Theirs is a lonely, psychologically taxing vigil, a life dedicated to ensuring that the terrifying story of the Seraphis Belt remains a closed chapter in the history of the cosmos, and not a prelude to a far darker volume. Generations after the fire faded, the story of the Odyssey's call was no longer a classified report, but a foundational myth, taught to every child who dreamed of the stars. The final, definitive record was compiled by a historian named Ilara Vance, her voice calm and steady as she closed the digital pages of her chronicle. In the quiet of a recording studio, light years from the silent void of the Seraphis Belt, she spoke the words that would become the official epitaph for the crew. They ventured into the silence and gave us a warning written in fire and sacrifice. Their legacy is our vigilance. The universe is vast, and we are not alone in the dark. Her voice faded, leaving a profound stillness. The recording was complete, an audiobook that would be listened to in hushed classrooms and on the bridges of deep space vessels for centuries to come. It was more than a history. It was a vaccination against complacency, a story designed to inject a necessary, healthy fear into the heart of every explorer. We learned that the greatest discoveries are not always about what we find, but about what finds us, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that some truths are worth any price. The crew of the Odyssey's call did not just stop a monster. They gave us a new set of eyes with which to see the darkness, and a new understanding of the sacred responsibility that comes with answering a call from the unknown. The final transmission from Eva Rostova cuts through the static of history, a voice stripped of everything but its purpose. Some silence is a blessing. Preserve it. These were not words of despair, but a final, vital command etched into the void. The crew's sacrifice was a dual legacy, a fire that consumed a monster and a flare that illuminated a terrifying truth for all who would come after. They did not just destroy the Devourer of the Seraphis Belt. They gifted the galaxy a new kind of sight, the vision to see the potential predator lurking within any uncharted signal. Their heroism redefined courage, proving it is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk into the dark so that others may remain in the light. Their names are now a permanent part of our star charts, a constellation of caution that guides every new voyage. Yet, her final words carry a chilling implication that hangs in the air long after the transmission ends. The graveyard is gone, but the universe is infinite, and the silence it left behind is not empty, it is watchful. What other blessings of quiet rest undisturbed in the deep, and what price would we pay if we were ever tempted to break